Welcome. Welcome to day 2 of the Learning Ideas Conference. I'm David Goralnik, and I'm happy to be here with you once again for our second day of our conference and our first under this new name. So I'm going to shift over and show you something a little bit different. All right. So it's great to see everybody again for day 2 of the conference, and really a lot of talks again today, a lot of good talks coming up, all kinds of things. So welcome back. A couple quick notes as we go. Please, again, feel free to tweet about the conference using the hashtag #LearningIdeasConf. So hope to get more activity online, so a lot of shares and a lot of all that. So it's great to see the participation. And our conference team will be on Twitter at the handle Learning Ideas Co. So always feel free to tag them or message them or anything that you want to do. And as has been the case with yesterday, the sessions are running in Zoom, accessible from Whova. So if you have questions or comments as we go, please post them in the Zoom Q&A, and that's what we're going to do. So again, great to see everybody, and I'm going to talk for a little bit this morning, and then we'll get on to our opening keynote for the day, and I'm excited about that as well. First, I want to talk a little bit about e-learning design and learning design in general. We covered a lot of that yesterday with Alicia's talk from the beginning with her opening keynote on user-centered design. So here's a story from my childhood, which was quite some time ago. This is back when I was in 5th grade. That is actually the school that I went to when I was in 5th grade. And it's a newer picture, but it kind of, look all that different. Outside of Washington, D.C., which is a terrific school called Green Acre School. Sorry, progressive elementary school, and really just an exceptional place to be able to learn. And one of the projects that was memorable for me was in 5th grade, where we were asked to learn about state governments by basically coming up, the end goal was to create a scrapbook with information about the state government. And you got to choose your own state. So I chose the state of Pennsylvania because I was actually born there, lived there for 1 year, the time I was born till 1, so I had very few memories of it, probably no memories of it. But I was interested, right? It had some meaning to me. I was interested to know, more about the state of my birth. And so my father had been in graduate school at the time, and he finished up when I was 1, and we moved, and that was it. But it had meaning to me. So the way the project worked, you needed to put together the scrapbook, and you had a lot of leeway in how to do it. You could do some library research. I mean, this was, you couldn't Google, right? This is way before you could Google and find things on the internet. So you did library research, you would write letters, it's very, different time. You would make phone calls, and you would connect a lot of different things. So, so there was a lot that you could do to, we lost the for a second. So there was a lot of different things that you could do to do this job, and that's kind of how this worked. So you had a lot of say in things. Your classmates were working on the project as well. They had their own states that had meaning to them, and this was just a fantastic project. It went on for quite some time. The teacher played the role of kind of a coach and mentor. So you would meet with her every week or so, talk about your progress. You would ask, maybe make some suggestions, but it wasn't instructive, right? Probably we were only 10. We didn't really know what all the things were to do. So she could tell us some things, but then you could come up with your own ideas, and you might learn something. You might, call up the Chamber of Commerce in the government of the state capital, and they would tell you something, and someone else you should call or write to and say, hey, I didn't know this existed. And you could go back and talk about that, and you could tell your friends. And it was a very collaborative environment. So you could talk with your friends about things. It was not competitive. Nobody was thinking, hey, I learned about the Chamber of Commerce, I'm not telling, Jeff. Like, no, you would actually go, you would be excited. You'd talk about it. You'd go tell Jeff, he'd tell you what he was working on. And that's how this would work. So it was really a very memorable and rich learning experience, and very open-ended. So there was an end goal and an end product, but it was really open-ended in what we could do. So the end product had to look something like this. I've searched long and hard to find the actual scrapbook from those years, and I'm absolutely certain it is buried in my parents' house or garage somewhere, and I haven't had a chance to find it, or haven't been able to successfully find it. I think it still exists, but it looked something like this. And that was the goal. So you would find these, you'd find the state bird and the state laws and all that. So how the logistics work, there was one teacher, about 15 students in the class. We did have budget by the time, the kind that you needed. It was not a problem to pay for stamps, supplies, long distance telephone calls. Students were encouraged to talk with each other about their projects, and that was very much the culture of the school. It was not at all difficult, to get that across. People were very happy to do that. So there's some key elements of this experience that I think are worth noting. One was learning by doing. We really did do something. It wasn't, we didn't exactly, we didn't get to practice being the governor. So it wasn't a, it wasn't a simulation where we got to really be the governor, but we were doing something, right? So we weren't, learning about state government by governing it, though that would be a fantastically interesting thing we could do on, in an online simulation. Was not something they would let 10-year-olds do in real life. Right? There's no safe simulated government we could create. Constructivism, we built something, right? So that was a very creative project, and we had to actually build something. Come up with, create a scrapbook, right? It wasn't, step by step, here's what you do. It was create a scrapbook, and it was, fairly open-ended. There was a goal, but you had a, lot of flexibility in how you got there and in exactly what you produced. But you weren't lost. You had a one-on-one coaching session every week, at least with your teacher. That teacher was around every day, so a lot of informal discussions as well. Also with the other students, a lot of informal discussions with your classmates and friends. And overall, you had an emotional connection to the project. Even from the beginning, you had to pick your state, right? Which seems small and insignificant, but that meant a lot. It was an interesting project, but it was a lot more interesting to explore the state that I was born in and didn't know that much about than it would have been to explore a state that was assigned to me. Right, so really, really different feel. So you can see a lot of these things that, I can imagine putting in an online learning program today, or any kind of learning experience today, and I have put in online learning experiences today, and they work tremendously well. And so, these are factors that, really can work in all sorts of situations. By comparison, one of the things that happen is then, as it happens when you're a kid, sometimes you move and you have to switch schools. And so we moved and I had to switch schools, and I ended up in a more traditional school, which looked something like this. And one of the things we did as I got a couple years older, which was in 7th grade when we moved, was take an English class where we learned the 12 rules of capitalization. And the goal was to memorize and recite the 12 rules of capitalization. And that was the project. Coming from the progressive school environment that I came from, I think when I heard this assignment, I think I might have laughed as if it wasn't really serious, but it was really serious. And, this was simply not effective, not in context, not applicable, and seemed, almost disrespectful, right? Like, were we making mistakes in capitalization? But also, you may know the rules, but are you going to know how to apply them? And being able to recite them doesn't necessarily mean, that means you have a good memory. Well, I was a responsible kid. They told me to recite the rules. I recited the rules fine. I wanted to get my grade and I was done. But it didn't help me perform the task any better. It didn't help anybody perform the task any better. And it was not an experience that anyone was particularly thrilled with, right? I was not the only one who felt like, this is really not an enjoyable or enriching experience, or one that makes me feel really good about myself or my educational experience. So it's a really big contrast. And so, but one of the questions then is, why would things be done this way in the school and not in the other school? And the big answer really at the root of things was that this experience I had at my first school was fantastic, but it doesn't scale up well at all, right? We had one teacher for 15 students, which is a pretty good ratio. We had some budget for calls and other things that were expensive at the time. We had a whole setup that just doesn't scale. You would need too many good teachers, you would need too much money, et cetera, et cetera. But online, we can do that, right? Online, we can build a great experience and it can scale up. And if we build something really good and really personalized using technology, we have the opportunity to do it for other, for large groups as well as small groups. Which is going to lead me to our opening keynote speaker for today, Deborah Howes. One of the places you find the best experiences is in museums. And museums have wonderful experiences and are repositioning themselves to be more easily accessible online. And that's one area that we're going to learn a lot more about in our keynote today, which I've been tremendously looking forward to and don't have to wait much longer. It's about a minute away. So we've got Deborah Howes with us. Deb is president of Howes Studio Incorporated. She is a professor at Johns Hopkins University in the Museum Studies program. She's dedicated to the concept that museums and their collections are essential catalysts for reinventing public education. She's directed innovative learning initiatives at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Modern Art. She's a board member emeritus of the Museum Computer Network and so many more things. I could probably spend the entire hour discussing Zeb's background, but instead what I'd rather do is turn it over to Deborah Howes to talk about museums as catalysts for digital learning. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen sharing and turn it over to Deb, and really looking forward to this talk. And there's just so much that we're going to be able to learn about how the museum experiences and the wonderful kinds of experiences that you can create both in person and online. All right, so with that, I think it's going to be all in Deb's hands. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you. And I would say, please welcome, and I hope you are welcoming. As usual, we can't hear the applause, but I know it's out there. So, all right, Deb, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, David, for that really lovely introduction. I'm hoping you can see my screen. Is that true?
It is. Everything looks great.
Okay, good. I also, just like while we're doing the housekeeping, I noticed yesterday that I was chatting and I hadn't changed my to in the chat box, and I wondered if everyone could just make sure their to says panelists and attendees, because like a good museum educator, I'd really like to engage the audience in my conversation today and get each of you speaking to each other. And thank you, Antonella. In fact, Antonella is the major reason I'm here today, so I want to thank her in person. I'm really looking forward to hearing her presentation. And David, thank you for that introduction. It couldn't be more perfect to set up for what I hope will be a convincing you that museums need to be part of your educational life. I'm really thrilled to be here today. I was able to attend yesterday morning this conference. It's my first time being part of this community, and I could see that okay, let's see, start my video. Yeah. Okay, now you can see me. Hello. And maybe the most important reason to see me is that you can see this great picture of where I'm speaking to you from, which is the Hudson Valley, home of the Lenape people, lived here many generations before Europeans arrived and fought bravely with the American Revolutionaries. So there's my land acknowledgement now that you can see me. The thing I want to start with, though, however, is just really, I'm going to try to convince you that museums are tremendous catalysts for social change, that they can really do a lot of work towards bringing equity and social justice to our communities, that they've been one of the forces for inclusion in every sense of that word. And the examples I bring to you today are going to underscore that. And I hope that you will ask questions in the chat. I won't always be able to keep up with them, but I think David might be keeping up with them because we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. I also want to start my talk with a memory. I don't know, David, were you reading my notes? The memory that I want to start with is actually your memory. I want you to think back to your earliest memory of being in a museum. You don't have to be an infant. You could be whatever your earliest memory is. And I have like a memory picture from for me that I hope will, just get you in the sense that you're in a time travel moment. And what I think about when I'm doing a museum memory is I want you to really focus on what do you remember seeing around you, what really inspired you, or what really disgusted you, or any other kind of emotion, any sensorial perception. What were you listening to? What were you talking about? Were you hungry? Was this in the gift shop? Where did you make connections? Just go back to that moment in this early museum memory and think about as many full aspects of that experience as you can. And now, when you feel like you have like one or two fun things to share about this memory, go ahead and put them in the chat box. And while you're doing that, I'm going to share with you mine. So I actually had not done this exercise until I prepared for this talk for you. And that's surprising because I'm a museum professional and you think I'd been thinking about, oh, what's my earliest memory? But I really hadn't. And I really appreciated what Alicia Sanchez said yesterday in the keynote about how our memories are kind of refashioned over time. So the story I'm going to relate to you may seem very clear, but given Alicia's example, which was striking, it may actually be a little bit patched together from what I know should have happened, but I think it's still illustrative. So I remember being in an all-white space with lots of glass cases all around me. It's a place that I think I'd been a couple different times, but this one particular visit stood out to me. And I was with my mother and my brother, who's about 6 years older than I am. And he let me know that on a regular basis. We were standing next to a box that was very, very tall and had lots of little tiny balls about this big coming down, really noisy, clattering balls that were coming down from the top and landing at the bottom. And my family sat there for quite a long time, and I found it tremendously uncomfortable and noisy and bad. And so at some point when I just couldn't stand it anymore, I said, what are you looking at? They weren't even reading the signs. They were just watching these balls fall. And they both looked at me. They came out of their trance of trying to do whatever it was this exhibit was teaching them. And they said, oh, you wouldn't understand. It's about math. Well, I got all huffy and I said, this is not about math. This is about balls. Dad, my father, the mathematician, said, math is about numbers, and there are no numbers here. These are about balls, and I want to go see the stuffed animals, please, in the other part of the museum. Okay, scene. So that's my early memory. And I was a little bit older when I figured out that this was actually a memory of witnessing an exhibit that was built for the 1964 World's Fair. I wasn't at the World's Fair, and maybe some of you were at the World's Fair and you're writing that memory in the box, but IBM created that exhibit for many other museums after it was so successful in the World's Fair. And I'm sorry it wasn't successful to me, but to be honest, I was 4 years old. And if it had been successful to inspire me to be a physicist or whatever, I think, my career would have been a little different. But nevertheless, it was an exhibit that was used for years in science exhibits. Maybe you remember it. And here's a picture to jog your memory that taught probability. This is the kind of experience that sticks in your mind. And for me, and it's very much like David's list. Again, David, were you looking at my notes? There are certain essential museum learning experiences that, it just makes the experience that much better, that it's not about being in a cold classroom with rows of chairs and the same textbook, that you are able to control your path of learning. I was certainly interested in taking my family away from the cold, noisy place that sounded like a pachinko parlor in Japan. And you can enter the museum to see whatever you want to see. There are no rules about the order, how long you can stay. It's really up to you to figure it out. And as you travel, most museums are designed in such a way to really engage your senses. If you're in an animal exhibit, you'll hear sounds of the animals. If you're in a decorative arts exhibit, like, the new galleries that just opened at the Met, you might see, you might hear music from the time period of those objects. There's all sorts of ways that museums create environments that trigger your senses to make the best possible environment. You also, generally speaking, you're socializing with others. You are not usually going to museums by yourself, although you're welcome to do so. But it's really a social experience. Even if you do come by yourself, you're with other people, and sometimes you're using exhibit elements that engage you together. The point here is that you're processing the information, you're sharing the information, you're comparing the information. And if the exhibit is done right, you're also learning from different points of view. This is something that we're going to come back to later, and something museums are getting even better at. One of the other things about what happens in a museum from a learning point of view is that you come with your own set of understanding. Math is about numbers. And you then realize that, oh, wait, I guess math isn't just about numbers. And that kind of realization is very much part of what makes the memory so strong. And another aspect, which, often happens in museums just by walking in the front door, there's a reason that the natural history museums put the most enormous and awe-inspiring skeletons at the very start of your tour. They want you to start with this idea. It's like, wow, they want you to have that emotional release, right? And so all of these things, these 6 things, the brain scientists in the audience and others, you might recognize these things. These are actually now known to us through imaging experiments. This is what makes memory strong. If you have these factors attached to any memory, it's going to stay in your amygdala for a really long time. So it's not just that we've done this by observation, or we kind of feel like this is a good way to teach. It's like, we know this is how you make memories, and museums are memory machines. That's what we do. We make memories. And if you, like me, if you've spent any time teaching people in museums, giving public tours, everybody's got a story. Everybody comes up to you, oh, I remember this painting when I was 5 years old. I remember being here on a school's trip. It's a very, very powerful memory making machine. So we have this great formula, museums, and we have this fantastic new platform, digital, whatever, fill in the blank. How can we make it better? How can we bring these museum practices to our digital learning and make it better for everyone everywhere? That's our goal today, to kind of explore together. This is my how part, and then there's a second part where we're going to talk about why. But let's just get through the how for the second. We reviewed some of these with the museum memory experience, giving users control over learning. That was something that David brought up very beautifully in his intro remarks. Thank you, David. Embracing multiple perspectives. That's a really important part, because in analyzing different kinds of information, you're using essential critical thinking skills. And that's a really important part of why the museum were made, to be honest. Just speaking for America, museums started becoming parts of civic culture as the big cities across our nation were being built. You didn't really have a big city unless it had a fantastic museum. And that was a way that the city fathers and hopefully mothers thought about bringing people together, to knit them together with some general understandings about primarily Western culture. And I'm not saying there isn't like an intention there that we'll get to later about colonial thinking and, de-emphasizing indigenous cultures, 100% true, but just to keep it on the learning track for the moment, and not taking away from that aspect, which we're now correcting. you walk through this space, you experience things together, you're learning about taste, about color patterns. If it's an art museum, for example, you're learning about what people who are perhaps more successful than you are collect and inspire. So it's giving you this idea about, maybe cultivating a little merchandising opportunity. I'm not saying all these things have the best intentions always, but they're effective. It's effective. And then something I really want to focus on a lot has to do with supporting the diverse learning modes. And, I think it's pretty clear when we talk about physical museum experiences inside what I mean by that. If you aren't able to read things like labels, very often museums will give you an alternative large print label format to take around with you to read them. If you are using the audio guide, sometimes there's alternative audio tracks that describe what you could see if you're having trouble seeing what's there. Lots of accommodations have been made for people who may not have all the same abilities to ingest information through their eyes with their ears. But I'm also talking about cognitive accessibility. There's a lot of programming that is going on in museums that have to do with reaching out to people who have different kinds of information processing, I don't want to say disorders, but needs. Some people get excited and want more of stimulation in the galleries. Some need places where there's less stimulation in the galleries. And so looking at that and trying to figure out how physically we can adjust that is difficult. But guess what? We're not here to talk about, or I'm not here to talk to you about the physical aspects of learning in a museum. We're really talking about digital today. And there's a lot we can talk about in terms of what can be done in this way. So those of you who have been on museum websites, this page might be familiar to you in probably a bad way. Like, it was amazing to me, and I've been doing this for, I don't know, 3 decades at least, maybe 4, managing different iterations of museum technology. And when the web came along in the mid-90s, it was interesting to me that the immediate solution to browsing in the galleries, and I was working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art at the time, was searching a database. That's just not an equivalent experience. There's nothing inherently educational about typing things into a search page. Usually it looks like this, and getting results. I don't know what word to type in. I don't know how to spell the artist's name. I don't know any categories. Thank goodness the Gilcrease Museum, whose collection page this is, actually gives you some categories to select from, because some of them are just blank for you to type in. And so all of a sudden in the mid-90s, and of course, the online collections, sort of the craze continued for the next 10 years. Every museum was sort of rated in its digital brilliance by how many and how fast these collections came to their websites. But when you zoom out to the macro view, honestly, they're incredibly exclusive. Like, not just that I don't know the names and whatever, it's just that I have to know what museum has which paintings to go to that database. And the databases aren't always so obvious to find on the website, even if I go to my favorite museum. So all of a sudden, something that was so easy to get to, I go to St. Louis, I go to the St. Louis Art Museum, I get in the door, is now like, where did I see that German Expressionist collection? Or I'm really interested in Max Beckmann. Where do I go? How do I see that? And, today, even this problem has not been resolved, BTW. And even the experts now will probably just type into Google Max Beckmann. And if they happen to know it's in St. Louis, great. But most people were like, German Expressionist. And then you could get film, it's just not very useful, friendly, accessible, certainly not inclusive. So I'm going to show you some, just a few examples of ways that we've made a lot of progress. And I want to, first of all, bow down in recognition to the Smithsonian. Maybe it hasn't been the most forefront museum for a while, but in the last 5 years, they have really been turning up the digital power. And they have hundreds of records online of 3D imaging, either photographic imaging, like you see this spacesuit, an Apollo spacesuit, which unfortunately in this slide, I can't do this, but when you go to the website, and the Smithsonian address here, you can actually manipulate it online, and you can share it, you can download it, you can insert it into whatever learning media that you like. And it's not just about aerospace. You can do it with vases, you can do it with insects, so many things in the Smithsonian's collection, spanning 35 institutions all over the world, are collected there. Not just museums, their research labs also contribute records. It's phenomenal. And I think Smithsonian is probably the only museum that could really have a name brand large enough so that people would actually go there. But they don't rely on that alone. They've created their own make your own collection site. I kid you not, it's called Learning Lab. There's the address. In Learning Lab, you make your own free account, and you can take from any of the collections in the Smithsonian database worlds, which is millions of records, and you can create your own collection that's always there whenever you want it. Not only can you create these collections, you can add things of your own. You can upload your own things to these collections. And let me tell you, K-12 teachers, they go nuts for this. Because year after year, they want to change what they're showing, what they're teaching. And if they have their little collection, Smithsonian collection area, they know they can go back every year when they're teaching, I don't know, let's say Black History Month. And they've got all their resources there, and they can continually update and add to them. It's phenomenal. And that does one more thing, which you can see on the slide where it says embed. You can embed a link to your collection, and you can also create a kind of a widget that you can put in your webpage so that your collection squares are right there. It's phenomenal. I don't know why every museum doesn't just use Learning Lab to make their collections accessible, and many are, but it is so open and so designed to be used by everyone everywhere. I really like to promote it any way I can. Recently, and this is really recent, like in the last month, a small museum in Los Angeles, the Hammer Museum, it's part of UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles, has put up what they call the Hammer Channel. Clever name, I thought. And then I realized what they're doing. It's phenomenal. They are having, like many museums, they've been sponsoring webinars over the past year on various topics related to their collection. And the Hammer in particular, I want to tip my hat to them. They've really been going in deep to support all the conversations around social justice and change. And one of these seminars had to do with the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, which many of you might have been hearing about because a couple weeks ago was the centennial of this event, which no one previous to this year practically had heard of, but except for the African-American communities that were tremendously affected by it when, unannounced and over a terrible misunderstanding, mobs of mostly white citizens of Tulsa came in and leveled a whole part of the Tulsa community, which had been known as Black Wall Street. It was a very successful area in Greenwood, and there was nothing left after 2 days of destruction. So the Hammer Museum brought together some of the greatest minds, historical minds, and other kinds of artists to talk about the historical context for this Tulsa Race Massacre. Now, that's a very normal thing for museums to do in their auditorium. And since last year, it's even normal to do in in a Zoom webinar that you may or may not have attended. It's even normal to go back and look at a recording. What's not normal is that they've created an entire open source engine, and you see my two little yellow arrows there, where you can go into this database, watch the recording, make a clip of your favorite part, and then share it using your social media or embed it into your LMS or whatever you're doing. Like, they are creating historical content for you to use and distribute and discuss. And I'm thinking, you know, for those of you who are in academia, I can imagine how many ways you might be using this. And this is actually the direction we want museums to really go into and bring into these partnerships. And I'll tell you, the whole engine behind this was developed by a really fantastic firm in London called CogApp. They go way back with digital media, and it's completely open source. So if you know how to do these things, you too can have this video functionality. If you go to the Hammer channel, you'll learn more about that. Staying on the topic of the Tulsa Race Massacre, there are local museums that are taking a different tactic, which is, for example, the Gilcrease Museum, the one I showed you the collection area search engine for previously. They just received in the last year hundreds of interviews that were collected by one woman you see on the upper right side of my screen, Eddie Faye Gates, historian, school teacher, dedicated her life to collecting oral histories of survivors of the race massacre. They sat in her house forever. Her family decided to give it to the Gilcrease Museum, and the Gilcrease Museum said, well, you know, we may have academic experts who can catalog these materials, but we need community experts. We need to get other people to listen and to catalog and tag this collection so that stories about storefronts that people remembered, or you know, barbershops that were there. I mean, there were a lot of very successful businesses in this area. And as the oral history narrators were recalling their experiences, we needed to be able to tag them with words and phrases that would be meaningful to the descendants and others, the historians, who would be looking for those tags. So that's the process that's happening right now. We're not just relying anymore on academics and who look at this kind of collection from one point of view. We're also inviting the community in. It's so important. And here's an example of why that's so important. The bottom part of the screen in yellow, I just learned about this like a week or two ago. There's a group called Urban Coders. They're a group of professionals who get together and help middle school students learn how to code. And they decided that what they could do with the middle school students is review museum records that exist about this disaster, not just Gilcrease Museum records. These are records all over. Library of Congress has records. There's records everywhere. We just weren't taught it in school. And they are literally rebuilding Tulsa's Black Wall Street as a series of websites representing each of the businesses that were destroyed. Now, not only is that a fantastic experience, as David's example demonstrated, for each individual middle school student, but that's actually making something that can visualize the what this street must have had, the vibrancy of the African-American culture that was there at one time. And I think for, you know, those of us who have these kinds of histories in our background where we focus on the destruction, it's also really important to talk about the successful parts. You know, that yes, people do survive. And I'm going to get to the why part later, but it leads into this concept of building resilience. Here's just another little example. I know many of you are involved in academic learning, higher ed, that is. And it's just a little project, but I think it's kind of like a little jewel. These scholars are invited to Amherst College from the Center of Humanistic Inquiry. They're young scholars. These are postdocs, generally speaking. And they are allowed to bring their topics of interest to the museum, the Mead Art Museum in this case, and they find records that support their theses. And, you know, it's not a huge idea, but the challenge here was that during COVID, they couldn't actually create the hallway exhibition that they usually do by putting things on the wall. They had to rethink it as a media element. And the result is this really phenomenal, multifaceted website that they created all these connections within their own discoveries about the understanding of home. And someone looked at prison as home, someone looked at cooking as home, someone found other kinds of records about what home means that related to Japanese incarceration. I mean, there were so many connections that came together, and they could visualize those connections in a web environment in a much more effective way than they could in the one hallway they were allowed every year at the museum. Of course, the most extraordinary and, you know, far-reaching example of museums doing this kind of work has to do with their collaborations with massive open online courses. And when I was at MoMA, it was the year of the MOOC. And in that, I think it was 2013, we convinced Coursera, which is the largest of those operations, but by no means the only, to let us in. Let us in because we were already making online courses and we knew how to do it. And they were not so happy in the beginning. They're like, oh, no, we're about universities, you're a museum. And, but they made a little space for us, which was, if you could do teacher professional development courses, we'll let you in. And I'm like, can we do teacher professional development? We do that all the time. We have workshops all summer long, and we grabbed the museum of the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Exploratorium, and the three of us, we made a bunch of MOOCs, and we get phone calls later from the people who watched the engagement numbers, and this is early on, like 2014, and they're like, what are you guys doing? And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, your numbers are off the chart. Like, people are watching every single video, and they're finishing all of the course. And I'm like, well, we're just teaching like museums, you know, like you know, we make good videos and they're short and they're about things that people want to know. And, you know, it helps that we're working on a teacher audience because they're really focused on working on it. But that really changed a lot about how we looked at Coursera as a platform, which MoMA still successfully does. They've got these 8 that you see on the screen, plus another one that they've just released. This one happens to be based on an exhibition that's currently open at the museum in New York. Again, going towards this effort to fill in the spaces in our historical records that have been absent. This exhibition goes back and tries to trace the reasons why Black architects and conversations around Black architecture and artists have not been part of the general mainstream conversation, and trying to make reparations around that. On the left, you see an installation by Maren Hassinger, wonderful artist. And on the right is a documentation of just like showing how their Black communities were welcome to be part of the groups who were building the houses, but they weren't invited, generally speaking, into the echelon of Black architects. And the 2 boxes at the bottom are taken directly from the museum's Coursera site. What their goals are to recognize how race and racism shape architecture and the built environment. So we're really doing a lot in terms of bringing equity forward and into a public forum. And one thing I can tell you about these museum courses, even beyond MoMA, is that they've learned how to merge them with their live programming. So when, for example, a curator who's featured in a course happens to travel to Berlin to give a talk, she will put out a message that goes out to all the Coursera enrollees, no matter when you enrolled, and says, hey, if you happen to be in Berlin next week, I'm going to be, you know, at this museum, come and hear my lecture. And they do show up. And of course, they're coming in the door too. But it's just interesting to note that those enrollees feel like they're part of our community now, our museum community. I want to point out that museums are just now understanding the power of Wikimedia and Wikipedia. One of the most interesting projects is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where they are record by record going through their collections of local, especially Black and Brown artists, and creating blogs about those artists and the importance they had in their community and making connections between the collections, and then keying those blog articles to Wikipedia entries that are about the artists or about a movement they were part of or connected to the museum in some way. They are literally knitting these stories back into our understanding of what is art in Philadelphia. And I really have to applaud Sinatra Smith, who's another super clever postdoc, who even goes so far as to use 3D tools to recreate places where Black artists convene using in a virtual environment. And this particular one is a bookstore that's been a very active place for people during the pandemic to come and meet. She recreates them virtually, these places virtually where people can meet virtually and continue the conversations. I'm going to end my how part with a fun moment to just consider. There was, just as the pandemic started, there just happened to be a program in place that I think had been going on for a while for Animal Crossing, New Horizons, and a few museums, including the Getty and the Met and the San Antonio Museum of Art, many others, but I just highlighting those, made their artwork available for this hugely popular Nintendo game in order for people to put these art objects in their spaces in Animal Crossing. And you could also create your own like little digital thing to put in your spaces. On the right, you see the rondel, the round painting in the San Antonio Museum's collection. And then you were able to create a kind of a barcode out of it that you would then manipulate and put into Animal Crossing. I mean, who wouldn't want to have this friendly part of their museum, you know, a friendly face associated with the museum being, you know, part of this hugely popular game. And I think there's a lot more we could do with this, but it was a great start and it really brightened some of our lives in the early part of the pandemic. Okay, now we're going to get to the why. And this is the part that David really wanted us to focus on. So I'm glad, we can get to it and really kind of dig in. I just want to go through a few projects. Some of these are projects that I was involved with personally. Some of them weren't, but they're all instrumental. Brooklyn Historical Society, back a few years ago, looking at their collection that was established hundreds of years ago, before New York City was even part of the States, understanding that their records are almost exclusively about white Europeans settling in Brooklyn. And anybody who knows anything about Brooklyn today knows that that is not the story of Brooklyn today. And what does a historical institution do to make up for this disjuncture between the legacy of the collection, land leases and wedding announcements hundreds of years ago, lists of congregation members and things like that, and other more interesting things like, maps and whatever, but all from this European perspective. And you have an environment today which is the most globally aware and active and vital you can imagine. Hundreds of languages are spoken in Brooklyn every day. And so the answer that they could afford, and I think nevertheless was really impactful, was let's create oral histories. Let's create a program that documents the communities that really make Brooklyn sing right now. And one of the communities they ended up documenting was Muslim community. They hired an oral historian to go out and find key people to be the narrators of these oral histories and wove it together into this fantastic archive and each oral history is like 2 hours long. Again, wonderful to have it, not terribly accessible, especially when Department of Education New York came and said, do you have anything for our students? We have a growing population of Muslim students in our school. We don't have anything for them. And they're like, well, we have these oral histories that are 2 hours long, maybe. And they're like, oh, well, can you edit them down? And we're like, we can do better than that. We can create a website like this one where we're, yes, editing them down, connecting the 5-minute clips into stories that relate to each other, exploring maps of Brooklyn based on these stories. We're tagging them with words that are relevant to people who live into Brooklyn now. We're attaching them to historical documents that we have. 1640, the first piece of land bought in Brooklyn. All of these things are coming together in these super exciting media rich websites. But we're back to the same problem, which is, how do I know it's there? If I'm working with the DOE in New York, okay, they'll know, but like, wouldn't most communities want to know about this? So museums are having a scale problem. One of the things that I'm hoping one of you brilliant people might be able to help us. And I just want to stop a second and put on my andragogy pedagogy hat, love that division that we heard about yesterday, and talk about social and emotional learning. It's not the first thing you think about when you're talking about museum learning, but it's super, super important that museums are telling stories. There are stories that are opening up our ability to empathize. There are stories that show the history of how our culture may or may not have started from a place with equity and how certain things have become not equitable. There are stories that we often just compare to ourselves and build our self-awareness. And they also are stories that, in some ways, they build our social confidence. Like, oh, I get that now. And let me tell you about what I just understood. That listening, that sharing is really, really important, especially for our younger audiences who, have really suffered in the last year for sure, but also many times they don't have the words to talk about the things that are really inside them creating some turmoil. But when they hear another voice that says, for example, I was 5 years old when 9/11 happened and I was scared and I wasn't able to function well in school and I had all these problems, but then I became a professor and now I teach about the history of Muslims in America, etc. Hearing those stories of resilience are super important. Museums are filled with them. We don't always project them or share them in a way that's easily understood. Hopefully we're getting better. Here's another example about getting better. National Gallery of Art in Washington, DC, really connected to the K-12 school teacher audience. They've been a major force in providing educational resources for a really long time. Hats off to them. What happened during the pandemic? They're like, well, we made a MOOC that was about raising critical thinking using art. But right now in this webinar, starting in, I think, the spring of 2020, late spring, they just went live every 2 weeks, bringing objects forward that teachers could readily use, modeling practices of how you have these conversations around tough topics. Here's just one screen from Julie Carmine, who's head of teacher programs, and some of her key educators who are interacting. And you can see hundreds of people around the world sharing their thoughts in the chat on the right about what they feel about their experiences, having heard a piece of jazz from and listening to the teachers walk through images created by Aaron Douglas, whose portrait you see here on the screen. Hugely successful. And here's another example of, another sector of our culture who doesn't always get associated with educational projects. Arts and Minds is a nonprofit mostly based in New York City. They've been organizing physical groups of seniors with dementia and their caregivers to come and have a social educational experience in galleries, physically in galleries. What happens in COVID? 1 week they're doing that. The next week they're getting everybody on Zoom, and they're having as you can see in the inset, in the screen, they're having these same kinds of social, conversational, educational experiences with each other over Zoom. And bonus, their family members can now join who may not be living in the area or whose schedules never allow them to come to the museum. So we're knitting families together over these really simple technologies like we're using right now. They're having conversations about art and history. They're having expressive opportunities to make art together. We are now creating an online educational program so that every museum educator, no matter where they are, can have this training and skill set so that they can do this for their communities. And, you know, this is essentially so important for lifelong learning, but also it's public health. These seniors are very vulnerable to isolation. Now they have a way to connect with their families, to card, with social, with conversations. They're happier, they're feeling better. They're doing all sorts of amazing things that no one ever thought they could. I just want to end with this plug, may surprise you, for two government organizations that are really important to watch for. One, we already talked about the Smithsonian. Another part of the Smithsonian, if you need to know one museum that's really getting it all right on every aspect of what they do, I have to point you in the direction of National Museum of African American History and Culture. It was founded not so long ago by a gentleman who is now the director of the Smithsonian. His name is Lonnie Bunch, and he's a true museum genius. He's just a genius, unqualified, but in the museum world, he has done things that no one ever thought possible. And what I want to tell you is that their resources that they put on the website, if these, if your interest is promoting anti-racist causes, social justice, equity, you will find tremendous numbers of things to read, to do, to know about. They have enormous community reach. Even before they opened, this museum was in the various African American communities all over North America, talking to them about their collections, helping them document their collections, putting together digital laboratories like in the parking lot so that they could be preserving memories and objects and you know, families, communities right there on the spot. A lot of really interesting, good resources are coming out of this museum. And the second thing at the bottom is something I don't know a tremendous amount about, but I just thought it was very important for all of us to know that somebody in the government thinks these kinds of efforts are important. The US Department of Education, National Endowment for Humanities, they put out a report. It's pretty extensive about how the humanities is not working. The way that we teach humanities is not working. And we need new models of educating for American democracy. That involves a lot of the things I've talked about, including critical thinking, using primary sources like museum objects for sources of civic discussion and a reevaluation of history. So, my friends, there should be money to follow after this kind of push from the top to really think about how we could do things differently. And so I hope I've done my job right. I've tried to touch upon all of these aspects. I know you all come from a wide variety of places and disciplines, but I do believe there's a museum in your future, and I hope that we can spark some partnerships by talking about them. Back to you, David.
All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Deb. That was fantastic. And we do have time for questions and comments and all of that. So if people have questions you can put them in the Q&A. I'll check the chat as well. So anything else that people want to ask? And I, of course, always have a couple of things as well. So while we're waiting for other questions, so one of the things I kind of want to get your thoughts on is, you talked especially at the end about, about critical thinking skills and about sort of changing education. what are your thoughts on, clearly these are better ways, right? So what are your thoughts on how to really manage change, right? And people grew up memorizing the 12 rules of capitalization. A lot of people did. Most people did, I would argue, in the US. And so they think that's what school almost has to be, right? And there's always a part of you that feels like, well, I suffer through this, everybody should suffer through this, right? That's, that's why I became an adult, so that children will suffer through what I did. That isn't the view that we have of education. But how do we kind of get the word, get the word out and help also assure people that open-ended creative forms of education aren't missing things, right? Like you're not missing, it's like, well, but I need my child to know the 12 rules. How am I going to know if they know the 12 rules? So how do we combat that and sort of use some of the museum exhibits maybe as examples to say, these are examples of education that really, really works and is different. This is how. So it's I think the questions could be longer than the answer, but I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, unlike most museum educators, I actually have a degree in education. So I know that sounds weird, but most museum educators come from the discipline of the museum that they're in. And then they might do professional development, but and the place I got my education degree was founded by John Dewey. And so this was actually a huge discussion right from graduate school for me. And this is, of course, several decades from now. And I think it has to do with, I'm sorry if this might sound a little like education political, but, there was a moment where technology was brought into education for what I think are the wrong reasons. It was brought in a way to quantify things that, took time, like grading hundreds of students' papers. It just took time. And how can we recreate education around things that actually computers, or yes, humans to a certain extent, but computers could really do at a larger scale? And that is a very simplistic beginning statement to things like, why the SATs are the way they are, right? Because how are you going to process some kind of arbitrary amount of achievement, in this sort of like, anonymous way? And I think that's what really encouraged people like your teacher who wanted you to memorize all the rules. I didn't even know there were rules around capitalization, but it's never been a problem for me. I think I know how to capitalize. It's not one of the mistakes I always make, but I had never had to do what you did, but I learned it by reading and watching and, getting papers corrected and whatever. So the reason why the progressive movement never liked computers is because of this bias in the beginning, that they saw that as a way of, like you said, dehumanizing, right, rather than humanizing. And I think, part of what I wanted to talk about today was really like where you were saying is like, how do we use computers to actually bring the humanizing back in? And I don't, both of my children graduated college with BFAs. Hugely controversial in Manhattan to send your children to art school. I was literally told by people who knew that I work for an art museum that my daughters were too smart to go to art school. And, I think that it's our problem. I don't think it has anything to do with what, the value of teaching one way or another, but we've decided that the quantity of information that you know and understand is more important than how that information actually works. And I think we're getting to understand where that's led us down the wrong path, because we need to keep our critical thinking skills about us, right? And if we're just memorizing lists of things, which by the way, I can look up on Google now, right? So those biases were developed in a time when we didn't have this amazing information machine at our fingertips, but now we do. And how do we teach our youth, but even our adults, how to use those information machines in ways that broaden our thinking about something, not close it down?
Oh, and in some ways, sometimes to me, it feels as if teaching the adults is more of the challenge because people grew up thinking of education in a certain way, and when you're used to thinking of it as something that in a certain way and you've experienced it, changing the way you think about it is hard. Children that are growing up now are in a different world and probably more open to new ideas and new ways of thinking. They don't have established ways of thinking. They're in the same way. So something interesting. Moving on, just there are more questions coming in. So Antonella has a question about, she wants to know, what are your thoughts regarding the role of museum education in the world recovery plan after the pandemic? So, which is essentially based on the care of the planet. So how can heritage education play a role in environmental and sustainable plans and projects?
Yeah. Well, I guess have two maybe examples that I think aren't enough examples, but they're a start. I think it was back in the 80s. Zoos had a huge rethink about what are they about. And they made I don't know if it was intentional, conscious, or just sort of like a zeitgeist movement towards the purpose of a museum visit is for you to understand nature as a place that you can care for, that you have a part of. And one of the best examples I can give you, just to give a solid nugget there, is the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I think 20 years ago, they came up with this idea of seafood watch. And it started as something you could print off the internet that fits in your wallet. It's like a little credit card size piece of paper that they would update regularly with all the fish you were allowed to eat that wasn't being overfished or endangered or whatever. So you go to the restaurant, you take out your seafood watch card, you look at the menu, you buy what you want. We thought, well, that was interesting. We never knew that was going to really have a big impact. But in fact, what the Monterey Bay Aquarium has done is really brought that to, over the years, they've gone to the suppliers and the whatever. And now Seafood Watch is this huge watchdog organization. And there's an app that you can buy that will update instantly what you can do as a consumer to buy fish. But also I go to my store now in Manhattan, and it shows the Seafood Watch approval listing. Yes, sort of okay, whether I should buy the fish or not. And so I feel like things like that can be done from museums, that we can take those places. But I think maybe the examples of that aren't as wide as just a general understanding. So the issues around how fragile our planet are, and how important how important it is for everyone to have these environmental guidelines, is not just for science museums, it's also for art museums. MoMA has put on, for example, Paola Antonelli, who's the curator of design there for many years. She brought together for the Milan Triennial 2 years ago an exhibition called Broken Nature, inviting designers from all over the world to talk about how design played a role in saving the planet. And also how design has turned their back on their role in changing the planet. And it was several football fields of installations. It was like the Olympics of designers. Every country featured at least 2 or 3 artists who had a completely different understanding of concept, focus, media, material. Some used digital, some used natural elements. And walking through there, you would just never feel the same way about the planet, or your ability to do something, or your talent in identifying things that were going the wrong direction. It was hugely effective. There was a small piece of it on display recently at MoMA during the pandemic. I'm not sure a lot of people saw it, but the original was really fantastic. And it harkened back to, speaking of 1964 World's Fair. I mean, those World Fairs, my family went all the time. I mean, mostly because my father, the mathematician, was interested in the technology, but like they really were world educational activities, of course, funded by the corporations. But nevertheless, you learned a lot about what architecture could look like, seeing a Bucky Fuller dome. I mean, it was a lot of exposure to new things. And I think museums have now taken on that mantle and are trying to figure out ways, both digital and not digital, to be responsible towards our civilization and keeping in mind the right path that we should be following.
Right. And following on that question from Shelby Marshall, it says, I loved your presentation and also wanted to know if you could give your thoughts on best practices for using digital technology on site in museums, and also what you hope to see in that area in the future.
Oh, that's you probably asked that question very innocently. And it's such a loaded question. Did you say that was Shelby who asked that question?
It was Shelby.
Yeah. Hi, Shelby. Before COVID, I don't get too involved with the on-site physical installations anymore, but I used to oversee them at the Met from the educational point of view. And, we used whatever would work, like touch screen here, like projection there. But now with this idea that maybe we shouldn't all be touching the same thing, has really upended. I mean, I just gave an example from the art museum, but that's they have the least amount of problems. You go to a science museum and you think about all the surfaces that are being touched, and our gesture-based technology is just not there yet. So my feeling is there's going to be a lot of emphasis on what we call bring your own device, BYOD. And, we kind of got away from, and I think for a good reason, downloading individual apps for every darn museum that you go to. But I feel like we have to kind of go back there. I mean, everyone always has the phone in their hand anyway now. And so they're either taking pictures or they're texting somebody about this great thing they're seeing in the galleries. So I think we have to build on that behavior to figure out ways that we can really enhance museum experiences using digitally. My first option for that would be to allow things to be more accessible in the more traditional understanding of that. In other words, I can't see the label. Can I see it bigger on my screen? Or I can't hear what they're saying. Can I amplify the sound with my phone? But it also has a lot of implications for what I was talking about earlier in terms of multiple perspectives. Well, that's what the curator thinks, but I wonder what a Native American would say about this painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware with a Native American at the tiller. No, what do you call the thing that drives the boat? Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting point. And, you want to hear that perspective. They have it printed on the label, but maybe it would be nice to hear someone talking about the impact that had on them when they saw that.
So sort of a mixed experience, taking what's physically in the museum and
right.
sort of augmenting that. So sort of I don't know exactly augmented reality if you're augmenting something that's sort of, already a step away from reality, but augmenting the experience that way.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. And I mean, I guess following on that, I don't know if there might be things that would be controllable by your phone. So not necessarily everything would be a download, but you would control from your phone so that you didn't have to touch the screen itself, but could continue some of the experiences that are out there. So we'll see.
I mean, QR codes are the things we love to hate, but honestly, they really work.
All right. Well, on that note, we have a couple more things. I think are a couple more questions, but we are out of time. So hopefully you'll be around for more questions in the chat and in Huva and everywhere else. And
sure.
It's just such a pleasure speaking with you as always, and really enjoyed your talk this morning. So great to talk with you. Thanks again to everyone for your participation this morning. We're going to take a 15-minute break and then back with parallel sessions starting at 10:30. So thanks once again.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thank
you too. Okay. Bye-bye.